Hi everybody, welcome back to English 112. This is for our class for Tuesday, the 26th, where we are in the midst of talking about poetry. And as I indicated, I wanted to devote most of the Thursday class as an open class to working on paper number 1. I should have returned your journal to you by this point. So that means if you've got any questions or concerns, please let me know. Hopefully that journal will assist you in formulating some kind of an argument. And in terms of our textbook on page 627, it talks about writing and reading about poetry. Some questions to consider as we're in the poetry unit, just to review. Who is speaking? And is the speaker addressing anybody in particular? Remember, we shouldn't necessarily assume that the poet is the speaker. How did you respond to the speaker? Favorably, unfavorably, and why? Is there a specific setting of time and place? Sometimes there is, sometimes there isn't. Does reading the poem out loud help you understand it? And I suggest that it definitely will help to hear the poem. Does a paraphrase or stating it in your own words reveal the basic premise of the poem? And I would argue that yes, it would. What does the title emphasize? You can see that many of these suggestions are suggestions that are carried forth from the drama and the short story unit. Are there any allusions or connections that enrich the poem's meaning? How does the diction or the use of language contribute to its meaning? Are there any figures of speech used or any symbols, or what other details can you identify in terms of the poem that you could analyze? Is there irony used, and if so, how? What is the tone of the poem? How does the poem use rhyme or meter or other sound, such as alliteration? Remember, rhyme is the ending of the word sounding similar, and meter is the beat of a poem, and alliteration is the beginnings of the word sounding similar. Does the poem's form, its overall structure, follow an established pattern? Is the language of the poem intense and concentrated? And I would argue that it would be. Did you enjoy the poem? Why or why not? Is there a particular critical approach that seems especially appropriate for the poem? And how might knowing something like biographical information about the author help you understand the poem? Or how might knowing historical information about the time period that the poem was written in help you understand the poem? To what extent do your own experiences, values, beliefs, and assumptions inform your interpretation? And what kinds of evidence from the poem are you focusing on? And considering that there are a variety of ways to analyze poetry and interpret poetry, which one seems the most useful to you and why? And we had talked about explication, which sounds like the word explain. The idea of an explication is that you are analyzing the poem, but you're doing it in a very detailed and methodical way, much more so than you might do with a short story or with a drama, because you're looking at every word from piece of punctuation to piece of punctuation and trying to come up with a valid argument. And I wanted to begin our poetry unit with a Shakespearean sonnet. And not to say that there wasn't poetry written before Shakespeare, but we probably are well aware of Shakespeare's reputation as a dramatist and also as a poet, because we know that he utilized poetry in his dramas. And it's believed that when the theater houses were closed because of plague, that ultimately Shakespeare probably wrote most of his sonnets. And probably his most famous sonnet is Shall I Compare Thee to a Summer's Day? Note that there are no titles to the sonnets, and Shakespeare wrote over 100 of them. We refer to the sonnets either by their first line, or we can refer to their number because scholars have tried to put them in numerical order. And you'll notice that the links that I've included for finding this particular poetry, if you're not using the classroom textbook, are oftentimes from the Poetry Foundation, which is a wonderful site for poetry. Sometimes it even includes oral readings of the poems themselves so that you can hear the poetry. Now, a Shakespearean sonnet had an incredibly strict structure. It had to be 14 lines, and it had to have a particular rhyme scheme or rhyme pattern. That was A B A B, C D C D, E F E F, and then finally GG. Those last two lines that would rhyme together would be known as a couplet, because basically a couple is two. It would be written in iambic pentameter. It's a 10-syllable line of stressed and unstressed. So it reads something like, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? And you should be able to hear that beat and find that pattern in all of his sonnets. And also the sonnets had to be about a lofty theme, something that would be worthy of a poem. So you can see that there are many rules, which is one of the reasons why the sorrowful woman was investigating writing a sonnet, because she was ultimately following the rules of wife and mother. And then she contemplates that maybe she doesn't have to follow the rules. So she thinks about, perhaps I don't have to write a sonnet. My poem doesn't even have to rhyme. But we know that by the ending of the story, she reverts back to following the rules of both being a wife and a mother by engaging in all of the activities associated with motherhood and with domesticity. And we also know that she writes a tablet full of love sonnets. So again, she goes back to following all of the rules. Scholars have divided up the sonnets, as I indicated, into two categories, the earlier set of sonnets and the later set of sonnets. And the earlier set of sonnets are thought to have been written to a young man, probably Shakespeare's patron. So these are read as sonnets of flattery, because it would be very important to have economic and even more so political support for one's art. And then the later set of sonnets are thought to have been written to a woman known as the Dark Lady, because she had dark features, dark hair, and dark eyes. Now, in some of the sonnets that you read, it's very clear that the sonnet is being written to a particular person. Other sonnets are much more general, so they could be applicable in a number of situations. But I still wanted you to get a sense of the fact that even though shall I compare thee to a summer's day is applicable to many situations and to many individuals, it is put in the early set of sonnets that are thought to have been written to a young man. And this is important because usually this sonnet is misread, and individuals will say that this particular sonnet is a love sonnet to a woman. And again, based on scholarship, no, this would be a sonnet that's written to Shakespeare's patron. But because there is no specific use of pronoun, it can apply to a number of situations and a number of individuals. So I just wanted to read the sonnet for you. It's on page 780 if you're using the text. And again, you can note that I have also included a link in the Poetry Foundation so that you could access that particular sonnet that way. And this particular sonnet, again, probably Shakespeare's most famous sonnet, reads, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? Thou art more lovely and more temperate. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May, and summer's lease hath all too short a date. Sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines, and often is his gold complexion dimmed. And every fair from fair sometime declines, by chance or nature's changing course, untrimmed. But thy eternal summer shall not fade, nor lose possession of that fair thou owest, nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So long as men can breathe, their eyes can see, so long lives this, and this gives life to thee. Notice that there are questions underneath that sonnet. For instance, describe the shift in tone and subject matter that begins in line 9. So that gives you an idea that there is a shift in line 9. Why is the speaker's loved one more lovely than a summer's day? What qualities does he admire in the loved one? What does the couplet, those last two lines that rhyme together, say about the relation between art and love? And what syllables are stressed in the final lines, and how do these syllables relate to the line's meaning? You may not necessarily be able to answer all of these questions, but these questions at least would give you an idea of how to proceed. Remember, if we were going to paraphrase this poem, basically a paraphrase is that the subject of this poem is more beautiful than summer, because summer is temporary and summer usually or can oftentimes be subject to bad weather. But this particular person will live eternally, unlike summer, because ultimately the person will be memorialized through the poem, through verse. If we were to explicate this poem and to go through it line by line, shall I compare thee, thee is you, but there's no gender specified, to a summer's day? Think about all of the possible associations with summer. That's supposed to represent the height of life. And daytime, that's also representative of the height of life. Thou, which means you, art more lovely and more temperate, saying this person is more lovely and more temperate than a summer's day. And then the explanation. Rough winds do shake the darling buds of May. So sometimes it can be very windy in May. The darling buds being the early flowers that have yet to bloom. And summer's lease hath all too short a date. And I love the idea of using lease, because lease means there is an ownership, that there is a finite beginning and a finite end. And summer's lease hath all too short a date. In other words, summer goes by too quickly. And sometime too hot the eye of heaven shines. And the eye of heaven would be the sun. And you might wonder, why didn't he just say sun? But remember, we've got strict parameters here in terms of the 10-syllable line and in terms of the rhyme. And often is his gold complexion dim. There's a long literary tradition referring to the sun as a he and the moon as a she in a feminine. And every fair from fair sometimes declines. And in this instance, fair doesn't necessarily mean justice. Fair means beauty. So if you've ever heard the fairy tale, mirror, mirror on the wall, who's the fairest one of all? In other words, who's the most beautiful? And every fair from fair sometimes declines. In other words, all beauty experiences descent by chance or nature's changing course untrimmed. Either there's a terrible accident, that's chance, or nature's changing course, basically untrimmed, meaning that aging ultimately will rob everyone of their beauty. But thy, again, notice that means your, but there is no gender specificity here. But thy eternal summer shall not fade. So Shakespeare's saying this person has an eternal summer after already establishing that summer is not eternal. Nor lose possession of that fair thou owest. And owest means possess in this particular instance. There's a footnote for that in our textbook. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade. A long literary tradition of categorizing death as masculine. In other words, death cannot basically destroy this person, which of course is an impossibility, so we're going to have to read on. Nor shall death brag thou wanderest in his shade, when in eternal lines to time thou growest. So this person will continue on in eternity. The question is how. And those last two lines, that couplet, almost serves as a concluding paragraph explaining. So long as men can breathe, their eyes can see. In other words, as long as there are human beings. So long lives this, and this gives life to thee. And this is in reference to the poem. The word this is a pronoun. It's taking the place of a noun, but we aren't told what noun is being replaced. So if you were to do this in your own writing, if you were writing a paper, I would highlight that and I would say something to the effect of unclear pronoun reference. This what? Be concrete. But so long lives this, and this gives life to thee, or so long lives this poem, and this poem gives life to thee. So basically, what Shakespeare is stating here is that the poet has the ability to immortalize through verse. And specifically, Shakespeare has the ability to offer immortality. And think about what a bold statement this would be, because immortality is supposed to be offered only through God. And now Shakespeare is saying God and myself. So there is a good amount of arrogance in there, though we've seen some of that arrogance in Midsummer Night's Dream. That's not to say that all of Shakespeare's poems read this way. In fact, in our textbook on page 781 at the bottom, it talks about another love poem, this one that was written to the Dark Lady. And my mistress's eyes are nothing like the sun. And it very much is a poem that upsets the romantic expectations of the day, because it talks about how this woman, which is how mistress was used at the time, it didn't necessarily have the negative connotations of an illicit relationship, that the mistress doesn't meet any of the poetic standards of beauty, but yet she's more beautiful because those poetic standards of beauty are an impossibility. It almost reminds me of what we were talking about with love poem, and contrasting that with the wonderful magic of love. So I wanted to move on to another poem, To His Coy Mistress. This is on page 647, and it was also written around the same period, a little bit later. I tried to put the poetry in chronological order so that you could see the progression over time, even though we're not reading many poems. This poem, To His Coy Mistress, was written in 1681 by Andrew Marvell. And this particular kind of poetry was known as metaphysical poetry, where they used extreme images. They tried to definitely shock. The idea was, I think, very similar to what we were talking about with the poem Catch, to try to outwit. And I don't think you can necessarily take it completely seriously. You've got to take it with a grain of salt. Some of the imagery is quite surprising considering the time period. But then again, we already know that the 1600s and the late 1500s were very bawdy and very sexual. We saw that in Shakespeare's writing as well. And To His Coy Mistress is basically a three-part argument. It has a small indentation for part 2 and part 3. It almost reads like an academic paper, in that it has a beginning, it has a middle, it has an end. And beyond that, though, it's going to definitely push boundaries and use extreme exaggeration. The idea behind this poem is that it's an attempt to woo a woman, but it also is known as a carpe diem poem, which means to seize the day. And I will read this poem to you. Had we but whirled enough in time, this coyness, lady, were no crime. We would sit down and think which way to walk, and pass our long love's day. Thou by the Indian Ganges side should rubies find. I by the tide of Humber would complain. I would love you 10 years before the flood, and you should, if you please, refuse, till the conversion of the Jews. My vegetable love should grow vaster than empires and more slow. 100 years should go to praise thine eyes, and on thy forehead gaze. 200 to adore each breast, and 30,000 to the rest. An age at least every part, and the last age should show your heart. For, lady, you deserve this state, nor would I love at lower rate. But at my back I always hear Time's winged chariot hurrying near, and yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity. Thy beauty shall no more be found, nor in thy marble vault shall sound my echoing song. Then worms shall try that long-preserved virginity, and your quaint honor turn to dust, and into ashes all my lust. The grave's a fine and private place, but none, I think, do there embrace. Now, therefore, while the youthful hue sits on thy skin like morning dew, and while thy willing soul transpires at every pore with instant fires, now let us sport us while we may, and now, like amorous birds of prey, rather at once our time devour, than languish in his slow chat power. Let us roll all our strength and all our sweetness up into one ball, and tear our pleasures with rough strife through the iron gates of life. Thus, though we cannot make our sun stand still, yet we will make him run. So, and again, there are questions at the ending to help guide you. They tell you that this is a carpe diem poem, which I had already indicated. The idea that you need to live in the moment. That the poem is divided into a three-part argument. What is the speaker's tone? How does the speaker's tone change around line 21? And how did you respond to that particular poem? And if we were to go through it again from the beginning and to try to explicate this particular poem, basically, the first part is about if they had time, he would spend eternity, in effect, trying to woo this woman. Had we but whirled enough in time, this coyness lady were no crime. Coyness is shyness, and notice the title, it says coy mistress. Again, mistress would be a woman, not necessarily with the connotations the negative connotations of an illicit relationship. Had we but whirled in time, then it would be fine to be shy. We could sit down and think which way to walk. Imagine that, just trying to contemplate which direction to take and pass our long love's day. Thou by the Indian Ganges side should rubies find. You could go to India and look for rubies. I by the tide of Humber would complain. And Humber is a river that basically flows in England. So he could be in England. I would love you 10 years before the flood. Flood is capitalized. It is in reference to Noah and the biblical flood. And you should, if you please, refuse till the conversion of the Jews. The idea is that this would be eternity because the Jews will never convert. My vegetable love should grow vaster than empires and more slow. And think about the phallic possibilities with some of the shapes of vegetables. And 100 years should go to praise thine eyes, and on thy forehead gaze. He would spend 100 years praising her beauty. 200 to adore each breast. So that would be 400 years adoring just her breasts. But 30,000 to the rest, 30,000 years to the rest of her body. An age at least to every part, and the last age should show your heart. For lady, you deserve this state, nor would I love at a lower rate. In other words, she deserves this kind of time and attention. But, and this is where we get the second part of the argument with the indentation. At my back I always hear time's winged chariot hurrying near. In other words, time is wasting. And yonder all before us lie deserts of vast eternity, or eternity, as I read it, so that we could keep the rhyme there. And thy beauty shall no more be found, nor in thy marble vault shall sound my echoing song. That eventually she will die, and she will lose her beauty, and will be, her corpse, in a marble vault. And what happens to her in that marble vault? Then worms shall try thy long-preserved virginity or virginity. In other words, the virginity that she's trying to maintain will be taken by worms. Again, think about the phallic nature of worms. Again, you have to wonder, is this the way to woo somebody? It's quite macabre. But again, we're not supposed to take it completely seriously. And your queen honor turned to dust and into ashes all my lust. In other words, they would just waste all of their possibilities of consummating this relationship. The grave's a fine and private place, but none, I think, do there embrace. And then finally the ending. Now, therefore, while the youthful hue sits on thy skin like morning dew. In other words, while you're young, you're full of beauty and energy. And while thy willing soul transpires at every pore with instant fires. Now let us sport us while we may. And now, like amorous birds of prey, rather at once our time devour than languish in a slow chapped power. In other words, let's take the lead and use time rather than let time use us. Let us roll all our strength and all our sweetness up into one ball. In other words, let them become one. And tear our pleasures with rough strife through the iron gates of life. And we usually talk about the golden gates of heaven, but he's talking about the iron gates of life. Let's enjoy the moment now. Thus, though we cannot make our sun stand still, in other words, we can't stop time, yet we will make him run. The idea is that we will give time a run for its money, so to speak. But there was also another poem, another metaphysical poem at the time that was called The Sun Also Rising. So anybody who was reading this particular poem and saw that reference about we cannot make our sun stand still would know that that's a wink and a nod to another metaphysical poem. So This particular poetry I've always found to be interesting because it is so extreme. I've found that usually there are two groups, the group that loves metaphysical poetry, the group that hates metaphysical poetry. Again, I'm just giving you one example of a sonnet and just one example of a metaphysical poet, just to give you an idea of what was happening during this time period. Obviously, you could read many more examples. And I wanted to put closure to the 1600s, and I'm obviously fond of the 1600s because I've selected 3 poems from that time period. The author to her book by Anne Bradstreet. And this was usually considered to be a male-centric time period, but we here have a woman who was writing and, more importantly, who was able to be published. So I thought it was important to be able to identify that particular poem. And this is on page 692 if you were using the textbook. And one of the things that I think is so interesting about this poem is its subject matter, and that it's comparing authorship to motherhood. And that might be one of the reasons why this female author, through her use of an extended metaphor, a metaphor is a comparison of 2 dissimilar things. In this instance, it would be motherhood and writing. Think about how we talked about this with catch. When we talked about playing a game of catch was similar to writing. This metaphor is continued throughout the entire poem, but for female, motherhood is usually considered the primary or one of the primary identities and roles. So perhaps her use of motherhood and its associations with female allowed her to talk about associations that would not necessarily be connected with female, such as authorhood, and is one of the reasons why this poem was successful. So birthing and raising a child is similar to writing and publishing a text. There's a good amount of humor and affection in there, as well as some self-deprecation. And I'll read it to you here. The author to her book. Thou ill-formed offspring of my feeble brain, who after birth didst by my side remain, till snatched from thence by friends less wise than true, who thee abroad exposed to public view, made thee in rags halting to the press to trudge, where errors were not lessened, all may judge. At thy return, my blushing was not small, my rambling brat in print should mother call. I cast thee by as one unfit for light, thy visage was so irksome in my sight. Yet being mine own, at length affection would thy blemishes amend, if so I could. I washed thy face, but more defects I saw, and rubbing off a spot, still made a flaw. I stretched thy joints to make thee even feet, yet still thou runnest more hobbling than is meet. And better dressed to trim thee was my mind, but naught save homespun cloth in the house I find. In this array mongst vulgars mayst thou roam, in critics' hands beware thou dost not come. And take thy way, where yet thou art not known. And if for thy father ask, say thou'st had none. And for thy mother, she alas is poor, which caused her thus to send thee out of door. And you can see that the textbook offers us a paraphrase here, that the extended metaphor likens her book to a child, which would come naturally to Bradstreet and allowed her to regard her work both critically and affectionately. Her conception of the book as a child creates just the right amount, or creates just the right tone of amusement, self-deprecation, and concern. And if we were to go through and explicate this and to talk a little bit about the poem from beginning to end, she is talking to the child, but also her writing, thou ill-formed offspring. And she's referring to her writing as offspring because it is a part of her, and ill-formed in that it's not doing what she wants it to do. Of my feeble brain, that her brain isn't strong enough to make this writing form into the shape she wants it to. Who after birth did by my side remain, which is what happens with children, is that they, after birth, they remain by the side of their mother, and also a piece of writing remains with you, till snatched from thence by friends less wise than true, until eventually somebody takes it from you, a friend, or it could be a critic, or family member, whether they take the child, or, again, it could be a caretaker. or an editor, as somebody who's looking at the writing, or a teacher, who thee abroad exposed to public view. So now everybody is judging you based on your product, whether it be your writing or whether it be your child. Made thee in rags halting to the press to trudge, where errors were not lessened, all may judge. In other words, everybody is judging based on the errors or the flaws of either the child or the writing. At thy return, my blushing was not small. Eventually, the child will come back to the parent, and eventually the writing will come back to the author. Think about how a teacher would look at a piece of writing and then return it back. My rambling brat in print should mother call. So we talk about rambling brats in relation to children, but a piece of writing could be a rambling brat. I've oftentimes had students say that they know what they want to say, but they just aren't able to make it happen in their own writing. I cast thee by as one unfit for light. Thy visage was so irksome in my sight. So you can get this sense of frustration that a parent, particularly a mother, might have with a child, but more importantly, that a writer might have with their own child, their writing. Yet be mine own, and at length affection would thy blemishes amend, if so I could. In other words, there's still this sense of love and affection and responsibility, both for one's child and one's writing, to try to improve it. I washed thy face, but more defects I saw, and trying to improve it, it made things worse. And rubbing off a spot still made a flaw, whether that's for the child or the actual writing. I stretched thy joints to make thee even feet, yet still thou runnest more hobbling than is meet. Some punning here, because not only do children have feet, but also we talk about the beat of a poem as a metrical foot. And better dressed to trim thee was my mind. So the idea of maybe if I will dress up the child in better clothing, or dress up the piece of writing in fancy paper, let's say, or fancy font, then things will be better. But not save homespun cloth in the house I could find. I really couldn't find anything at all. And even if I did, that would be false. That's not going to change the actual nature of the child or the writing. In this array mongst vulgars mayst thou roam. And the idea of roaming, not having direction, which can be for the child, but also for the writing. In critics' hands beware thou dost not come. So watch out for critics, of people who will criticize you and your child rearing, or criticize your writing abilities. And take thy way where yet thou art not known. If for thy father hast, say thou had none, which I find to be a very interesting line. The idea that we've got a single parent here, or if you think about the writing process, really it's supposed to be single. The writer is supposed to be producing their own work. They're not supposed to be basically getting help from others. But is that completely true? Because ultimately, a child cannot be created without two. And ultimately, I doubt that a writer is able to create without having some help one way or another, either in their past, their present, or their future. And if for thy mother, she alas is poor, which caused her thus to send thee out of door. So why is it that a piece of writing or a child is ultimately sent out into the world, even though the child or the writing hasn't reached perfection? Well, the mother is poor, or the creator is poor. There's an economic necessity for the child to be self-sufficient. There's an economic necessity for the writing to go out to the publisher so that you can be compensated. There's a practical necessity for you to give up your writing to a teacher so that you can earn a grade. So I think there are lots of parallels here with the writing process and with motherhood, but it also shows you some very different writing techniques that occurred in the fairly early days of poetry. So as I'm looking at the time, I think I'm just going to stop here for now. And then what I will do is talk briefly next class about William Blake, the Sick Rose. And perhaps I might talk very briefly about the other two poems. But as I said, I wanted to give some time in the event that you wanted to work on your paper as well. So I hope you are doing well. For today's attendance question, I thought I would ask, out of these three poems, shall I compare thee to a summer's day, to his coy mistress, or the author to her book? Which of these three poems did you prefer, and why? I hope you're doing well. I'm doing well, and we will continue on next class. Take care. Bye-bye.